Now we have enough time, good time for the Q&A. So anyone would like to ask a question? Okay. Can you raise 1, 2? Raise your hands, please.
My name is Katrine Bannach. I work for the Friedrich Naumann Foundation in Myanmar and Thailand. And as you mentioned, the expectations are sky high for the new government, and they have to develop, or they have to deliver economic prospect to the people in form of jobs and so on. Could you shed a bit more light on the economic policy of the NLD? Give a bit more details, because as you mentioned, this used to be a black box for many of us.
My question is also about economics. I'd be curious to hear more from any of the speakers about how the economic outlook is likely to affect the peace process. Because, I mean, as we all know, the Burmese military has significant economic interests. And so I was curious whether you think that their economic outlook might encourage them to be more cooperative in the peace process, or whether they have such stake, whether their stake in the status quo economically might harm the peace process. Thank you.
Panya from financial consultant. To follow up with the prior two questions, I heard about 8 billion of FDI coming in. So is FDI helping, shaping the economic development? Is China the biggest FDI, the investors? Second, with the lack of experience of the administration, do you see any attempt of the administration trying to seek wisdom from outside help, like you panelists here? So 2 questions, thank you.
I'd like to ask a question concerning the issue of federalism, which seems to be a pretty basic issue going forward in Burma today. It's a double-barrel question. The first part of it relates to the NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi, and specifically whether she herself and the party more generally understand the implications of a federal system. She's been talking about it even before the election. Now we're hearing about a 21st century Pangalong conference. The original conference was, of course, about federalism. So does she and the party really know what they're dealing with here? The second part of a double-barrel question relates to China. China obviously has massive hidden influence in terms of its support for various armed ethnic organizations, most obviously the United Wa State Army, which is arguably one of the 2 or 3 largest non-state military actors globally. What would the panelists think, or what do you think about China's interest in a federal system in Burma, or perhaps China would prefer an ongoing centralized system in Burma? So a double-barrel question. Thank you.
My name is Kabiru Bala. I work with the Nigerian Embassy in Bangkok. I have 3 questions. 1 relating to foreign policy, 2 regarding citizenship in Myanmar, and 3 relating to federalism. Now, in April this month, the state councillor in Myanmar called for a foreign policy talk with diplomats in April. Now, I attended that foreign policy talk, and the sense I got away with from that talk was that ASEAN countries are going to form a very strong focus on their foreign policy direction. So I don't know what reaction you will have on this when one of the speakers prioritized UK, US, Scandinavian countries, and lastly Asian countries as a focus of the foreign policy direction of the new government in Myanmar. My second question relates to the citizenship laws in Myanmar. Are there prospects in the current peace process in the country to review citizenship laws in that country to allow citizenship to some ethnic groups in that country that have been there for generations to be regarded as citizens of Myanmar. Number 3, one of the speakers highlighted the challenges of history, the challenge of geography in Myanmar. Now, my question relates to federalism in this regard. How widespread is acceptance of federalism in Myanmar as a solution to its various problems? Is it acceptable to the military, to the ethnic groups there? I want to hear your comment on this. Thank you.
Economic policy of the NLD, not a lot of clarity, I would say. I think we await their vision of what the Myanmar economy looks like. It's not just about reforming economic laws and regulations to make the economy more effective and turn over more smoothly. It's about a vision for what sort of economy, of the many options out there, do they want to see? And we haven't had that. But to be fair, we didn't have that from the previous government very much either. It was very much a technocratic focus on laws and regulations. The political economy of the peace process is a very tricky and complicated subject. I think the military has given up an enormous amount of its economic power, and this is generally not recognized, basically through giving up their monopolies on all of the major sources of revenue that military companies enjoyed. Everything from importing of cars, petroleum products, cigarettes, alcohol. There's a whole slew of these very profitable areas of the economy that they haven't stopped operating in, but it's been opened up to competition, including international competition. So they've taken a fair hit there, along with the revocation of their tax-free status. So they now have to pay a lot of, they have to pay tax like everybody else, and they can't run imports and exports through their books and make money off it, which they did in the past. But I think the big question for the peace process is more the dark economy rather than the on-the-books economy. They're also involved in that, but so are many other actors. So when you have, potentially $20 billion in annual revenues from jade export, and only a tiny proportion of that on the books, clearly those revenues are going somewhere, and they're going in all sorts of directions. It's very murky, but unless you can get that, along with drugs, along with timber, along with the other resources in the periphery, unless you can get some clarity on where it's going and some control of it, then you have vast amounts of money, almost as big as the white economy, sloshing around, and clearly that has very serious impacts on the peace process in all kinds of directions. Federalism. Look, we've moved from a situation in 3-4 years when federalism was a taboo word for the military and for the previous ruling party, to a situation where it is widely accepted that some form of federalism is the solution. Widely accepted, but not universally accepted, I would say. There's concern still from the military that federalism equates with loss of control and perhaps center-periphery disintegration or tensions. And I think no one has really asked the Burman majority what they think about federalism. The ethnic peoples are all in favor of some sort of federal solution. The government has stated strongly that it's willing to consider and negotiate some sort of federal solution. But the Burman majority, when it gets round to being asked, may decide that it's not so keen on giving up so much political power and economic resources to the periphery. And when you have a rising or a continuingly powerful tide of Burman nationalism, Burman Buddhist nationalism, this could play actually in quite a complicated way. So do the NLD understand it and Aung San Suu Kyi? I mean, I think they accept, as the previous government came to accept, that some form of federalism is the solution. But I don't think anyone, not the government, not the ethnic groups, not the military, has any idea of what kind of federalism will work. And that's going to be a huge and complex negotiation that will no doubt take years. China, I think, we have to be careful what we mean when we say China. There are lots of different actors in China with different views, and I think China is bits of China, Beijing, are playing a long-term game, and bits of China, Beijing and elsewhere, are playing a short-term game as well, and their short-term game may actually be incompatible with their long-term game. Long-term, medium-term, it's clearly in the interests of China that Myanmar is a peaceful neighbor, that its borders are peaceful, that its black economy comes onto the books, that border issues like drugs and people smuggling and smuggling of resources comes to an end. In the short term, I think China sees its relationship not only with the WA, but with a number of other armed groups, as a significant lever that it has to exert as this new government comes to formulate its China policy. And so I think it's making clear, by pulling that lever, that it can create a lot of damage. It can be a very major spoiler in the peace process, and that its views need to be taken into account. I'm struck by the United Wa State Army or United Wa State Party statement of a couple of weeks ago in Chinese from Pangsang, but distributed, and it's I think an 8 or 9 point statement. You know, one of those points is Myanmar should embrace the One Belt, One Road. Now, this is bizarre coming from Pangsang. I mean, there's not going to be any belts or roads going very particularly close to Wa. It's clearly a Chinese policy initiative put through the Wa. So, yeah, I think that's. So the question is, are the short-term games and the long-term games coordinated? Are they being driven by the same actors in Beijing, in Kunming, or not? And I think there's not an awful lot of clarity on that. But more generally, I think, when we look at foreign policy and how Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD government will craft their China policy, I think there's been two different sets of discussion today. One has been, who is Aung San Suu Kyi close to, who does she like? That's a very different question from what will be her foreign policy priorities. Clearly, she's very close to the UK and the West. She, spent a lot of time there. She has cultural and personal connections. But I think, where will her focus be as foreign minister? Where does she believe the problems are? That's not the West. I think she feels that she has a good understanding of Western policy and a significant influence over it, and that's not going to be the priority of her administration. I think she understands that China, in getting that relationship right, is the most difficult and important thing to do, and she's shown that she's investing an awful lot in that. And I think for ASEAN, what she said at that meeting, sir, that you were at, and the fact that she called a separate sub-meeting afterwards with the ASEAN representatives, I would not necessarily interpret that as an indication that ASEAN will be her priority. I think she was attempting to demonstrate that the popular perception that she was very much against ASEAN and that ASEAN would be a big loser out of this was misplaced. She was trying to reassure. I'm not sure how much reassurance was achieved. I'm not sure how the ASEAN representatives coming out of that meeting felt, but I'm not sure that they're totally convinced that ASEAN will be at the center of her foreign policy, because of the history that Thitinan spoke about. Citizenship law, no chance, not going to be reviewed. The 1982 law is going to stay. However, it's often overplayed. I think if we look particularly at the most contentious issue of the Rohingya and other Muslim communities in Rakhine State, immigration ministry assessments are that perhaps 70 or 80% of those would be eligible for full citizenship, if those laws were applied in good faith. And so the law on the books is problematic because it links citizenship to race, and that's a very problematic linkage to have for all kinds of reasons. But it is not an insurmountable obstacle to providing citizenship to the currently stateless populations in Myanmar. And so a lot could be done within that law. Let's see if it can be. I'll stop there.
your question about the military and its economic interests and likelihood to affect peace prospects. I'm glad you raised that, because one thing I think wasn't covered was one of the big economic challenges for this government is redrawing the budget and budget priorities. And at one point, Aung San Suu Kyi flagged that she'd actually, I mean, the kind of increases that they've referred to in health and education spending are absolutely unreal and unachievable unless there are big cuts elsewhere. There's big moves to reform tax and actually increase tax collection revenues, but that's not going to do it overnight. So I think there is a feeling inside the government. Yes, the military still has its very powerful, pervasive economic conglomerates, Myanmar Union of Myanmar Economic Holdings and Myanmar Economic Corporation, MEC and MEHL. They make a lot of money. It's very murky. We're not sure how much, but it's very clear that one of those, MEHL, acts almost like a pension fund and a social security fund. They actually make loans to military units, all that sort of stuff. I think there would be a quid pro quo for the military taking a much smaller slice of the pie in terms of the overall budget, and it would seem to me that it's probably a big factor that they retain some element of money making in these conglomerates. MEC is in another category, but that's another conversation. So I just wanted to make that point about military budget.
Thank you. Lots of questions. I would like to start by saying that in a way it's a misnomer to say that this is an NLD government, because it's not the NLD that has all the cabinet positions. We already talked about the military. And you also have people who are not with the NLD who are in key positions in the government and in the parliament. And these are former USDP people or ex-military people. And they are seen as being people that have been recommended to her by U Shui Man, who is the previous Speaker of the Parliament. So it's a government chosen by her, not the party, all the ministers. And again, as Richard mentioned, the criteria mainly has been loyalty. And so it's not an NLD government, so to speak. That's why, in a way, it's also not relevant to talk about NLD policy, because that may or may not be applied, even if they had it. And right now, we haven't seen any clear policy positions from the party either. So you can't go by policy. And the other thing is that, as Richard also mentioned, lots of good intention, lots of good announcements about what's going to be happening. But the question really is there an ability or capacity to actually implement? You may redraw the budget, whatever, but if the bureaucracy is not there to actually do the work, reducing 36 ministries to 22, that's already created a huge roadblock. Most of the civil servants don't know what to do, so they're just sitting around. So you may come up with very good policy decisions, but if there's no implementation, both because of uncertainty and unclear procedures, and if the military doesn't agree, they can, they control the civil service, so they could easily block that. So we have lots of actually internal problems. The other thing is about the groups that have not signed, and the peace process, and the WA and all of that. The WA and the groups on the China border have had a ceasefire since the 1990s. And over the last 25 years, they've developed alternate
economy, so to speak. And most of it is black. It's not an official economy. So that's why it's going to be much harder now to have a peace process that will come up with a solution for those groups, because you're no longer just talking about politics. It's to do with the war economy that is very big. The other groups that have signed actually are more political, and they have less at stake in terms of the black economy. So they have some, but it's nothing compared to the groups on the China border. So once again, the question is, how do you solve it? Because the cronies are involved, the military is involved, the armed groups are involved, especially on that border, and it's a huge problem. And we don't have a government that has the knowledge or the capacity to solve it. That leads to the question about federalism. Until 3 years ago, if you talked about federalism, you could probably go to jail. So nobody discussed it. The NLD did not discuss it either. And I believe we gave one of the first trainings to the NLD in end of 2014. Beginning of 2015. So this is a completely new topic. Nobody really knows. The military has been engaged in some workshops on federalism. I think the most people who have gone through most of the federal workshops are the armed groups. Over the last 10 years or so, they have had a lot of input. But in terms of the general public, nobody really has any idea. And the difficulty here is that in terms of political power, it's the central, and they have controlled the economy from that. But in terms of resources, it's all in the ethnic area. So that's the main problem. Are they willing to give up some power? They may be willing to give up some power, but are they willing to give up the resource? Will there be a proper resource sharing? So it's a huge problem, again, and it will take years. But the military and the previous government actually signed the declaration, the deed of commitment last year, pledging that the purpose of the nationwide ceasefire would be to form a federal union. So in concept, they have agreed. But as Richard said, nobody has asked the majority people. And the majority Burma would probably agree if you say that the federalism you're looking at is more like the decentralization that has taken place in the last 5 years, because the Thein Sein government embarked on decentralization, and people are getting used to the idea that each region, each state can decide on certain things for themselves. So it would be more of the same, with maybe more political power and economic power. But it will not be, cannot be done overnight. It will probably be in stages. And also going to the citizenship thing, as Richard mentioned, it's really a red herring to be discussing citizenship laws and whether they apply to the Rohingya or not, because as it's very clear that at least 80% or so are citizens. The real problem is not citizenship. The real problem is discrimination and exclusion from the political process. They are citizens, but they cannot form parties. They cannot vote. These are serious issues. Not only that, they cannot travel. They're not allowed to travel out of the area in northern Rakhine. And not only that, they are not allowed to education. They can't go to universities. They're not allowed. And even if you can prove that you're a citizen, but you're a Muslim, they may allow you to go to the university, but you don't get a degree. You cannot graduate. So those are the more serious problems that have to be dealt with, not just others. So in a way, it's false to be arguing about citizenship. What is more serious is the discrimination and exclusion from the political process, from education, from health. Now, these are very, very serious issues. And I agree with Richard that you need to separate the UK. UK is a personal preference, but no matter who is the president of Burma, you cannot ignore China, India, and ASEAN. That's the reality, and I think that's how it will go. Thank you.
First, I think we have to ask the question: new leadership, how much can it really change state directions? So Duterte, he becomes a new leader, a new president. I mean, can he really turn things upside down? The answer is no. The answer is no. But he can change a lot of things with a lot of the things that he said. The same case with Donald Trump. I don't think he can turn the United States upside down, have institutions, have ways that things are done, they have the bureaucracy, but he can still do a lot at the margins. Now, for NLD-led Aung San Suu Kyi, the question is, how much can the new leadership, really change, and how much does it want to change? And the answer would be significant, but not complete flip, not a complete reversal. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The other thing is, she is early days. We have a lot of questions because we don't know how things will be. It's very early days, and we have not been here before. This is a new promised land that is promising but full of challenges. Will she be kind of personal, petty, vindictive, or will she be kind of magnanimous, and she'll see a lot of the issues beyond herself, her past suffering and so on? And this too, I think, is still early days. So far we've seen some pragmatism that I didn't anticipate quite early on. She went to visit Xi Jinping, she saw Wang Yi, she visited Laos, and she is showing early statecraft that we haven't seen before because she's not been here before. But if this kind of pragmatic statecraft continues, then we will see a very kind of sophisticated, nuanced approach. It's not going to be black-white. It's not going to be she's going to hate ASEAN, she's going to love the UK, like the US, love the Scandinavians. So it's not going to be like that. So far we've seen she's actually showing some practicalities. She's willing to talk to the ASEAN leaders. And this may be the case. It seems it's still early. Just a very few quick responses and reactions. Foreign policy direction of New Myanmar. If you look at the early moves, it suggests that there will be a lot of pragmatism that many would not anticipate in the recent past, given all of her adversity and suffering. On the economy, I think that the big issue would be, the GDP, Myanmar GDP will expand 6 to 8 to 10% a year for the next 5 years. It's from a low base, they're resource rich, capital be coming in, they have a lot of labor, ample labor, and it's the case conventionally with all the low base economies that they will expand for a while, 5 years, even more than 5 years, 6 to 8 to 10%. The big challenge will be whether it becomes aid dependent and resource cursed. So if you look at comparison, a good comparison would be Cambodia from 1993. After the 1993 election in May, Cambodia became kind of aid dependent, and but it's now emerging, it's diversified a bit more, but still this is something we're looking for in Myanmar. Diversification, some real investment in infrastructure, human infrastructure in terms of not just physical but in education and so on, building new talent, and a lot of the areas that would sustain a longer term path away from being an aid dependent country and a resource cursed country. China is interesting. I think that China has an interest in not having any unity anywhere that is against China. I still remember Fu Ying said, this is a senior official at one time in an open forum, that China will not support ASEAN unity against China. So if ASEAN unites, it can unite on a lot of issues as long as it's not against China's interests. If it's against China's interests, then China is not going to support unity. So for Myanmar, I think that China would, if a peaceful federal government comes into being and it's not in China's interests, China will not be supportive. On the other hand, China has been supportive of, in the northern states, in Kachin, China has a lot of influence with not just the WA, the United Wa State Army, but also the Kokang. So it has an interest in a kind of some of the insurgency, ethnic minority movements in the north as a way of maintaining influence. Thailand has this had this policy in the past too, of having a so-called buffer policy, but that I think is no longer adhered to. But for a long time, there was a policy consensus around having a buffer on the Cambodia side, on the Myanmar side. You can have a lot of infighting, insurgency, ethnic conflicts. This is a way of maintaining influence and having a kind of a buffer. So I think that's the case still with China. Apart from that, I think overall we have to accept that, in Myanmar, I don't think it's going to be a clear-cut outcome in any way. It'll be like that movie, The Dog Day Afternoon, It'll be messy, but manageable, but still messy. And then Aung San Suu Kyi, I think her reputation, her popularity can only go down. It cannot go up because it was so high. And, as a democracy icon, it was easier to maintain that reputation, that popularity. But Dog Day Afternoon is okay. It's like that everywhere. So don't expect a clear-cut solution, smooth path. It'll be bumpy, it'll be manageable in some areas, and there'll be a lot of criticisms. But overall, as long as there's a forward-moving balance, the military is on side, its corporate interests are somewhat protected, and then the civilians get to rule based on popular mandate. And then there's some development and stay away from resource curses, stay away from aid dependence, and then have some kind of bottom-up development, education, infrastructure, and so on. That's probably the best that we can hope for the next 10 years.
Wanted to answer that. I don't think anyone's tackled the FDI question, have they? The figures. It's a good point about whether FDI can help shape economic policy. Up to in the past, all that FDI was basically just going into oil and gas, and even then it was just mainly gas. And there was a lot going into, but sort of in the black economy, into natural resources, probably, sort of extracting God knows what, everything from jade to timber. But oddly, and I was just looking at these figures, but actually this past year is sort of amounting to, it's actually closer to $9 billion. A lot of that, there's been a big change in the nature of FDI, and it's interesting because although you've still got huge amounts going into gas more than oil or exploration, you've also got massive amounts going into telecoms because of these huge contracts that have been let in the last couple of years. So companies like Telenor and Ooredoo have just sunk. I mean, there are gazillions of towers being built throughout the country that's creating a lot of jobs, and it translates to a lot of foreign investment. I think also, oddly, in terms of the top foreign investors, it's not China anymore. In fact, the last couple of years it's been Singapore, and China is a close second, but Singapore is at the top precisely because a lot of the investment that's coming from the US or Japan, a couple of other countries, even Brits, a lot of that is coming into Myanmar through Singapore-registered companies. So it shows up as a Singaporean investment. In fact, it can easily be a US investment or something. So in fact, the top four investors are Singapore, China, Hong Kong, and the Netherlands. Oddly, Netherlands, because of this massive beer investment, there's actually 3 big beer companies that have put money into breweries and things there. So anyway, I just thought I'd set that into perspective and leave you with one other figure which has always struck me, which is in 2009, total FDI into Myanmar was just under $330 million. So since 2009 alone, that has risen to $9 billion. So you can imagine the impact that's having on the country. Anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. We are running out of time. Sorry, I cannot correct more questions. But if you are interested, you can talk to our speaker after the closings. So I'm sure you share with me that it's a rich and very interesting forum. But of course, the Myanmar news era is still a long way to go. And I think we have to organize this sort of forum. Several more, and we discussing more problem and prospect and hope. Right. Okay. I would like to give special thanks to Richard and Han for trouble to join us in this forum, and also please join me in giving appreciation to all our speakers.